Today I'm presenting my dissertation proposal titled Regulating by Proxy, a comparative study of banking as a service enforcement practices and stakeholder perspectives. This research examines a critical friction point in the American financial system, the collision between 20th century banking laws and 21st century digital finance. Over the next 30 minutes, I'll outline the urgency of this problem, the theoretical framework I've adopted to analyze it, and the rigorous methodological design I intend to use to measure it. In May of 2024, Synapse, a middleware provider that wired fintech apps into partner banks, collapsed almost overnight. Thousands of Americans woke up locked out of their accounts. But the most alarming part wasn't the bankruptcy itself, it's what happened next. The regulated banks that were legally responsible for those deposits publicly acknowledged they couldn't immediately say which customer owned which dollar. Somewhere between the fintech's front end, Synapse's internal systems, and the bank's balance sheet, the basic function of banking, the ledger, had broken. Synapse turned a long theorized risk into a concrete crisis. It exposed the core black box problem at the heart of modern bank fintech ecosystems. We've engineered a system in which banks are required to own the risk, but in practice they often cannot see the customer or reconstruct the underlying transaction without a failing intermediary's cooperation. In principal agent terms, monitoring and information rights have been outsourced to entities that sit just on the edge of or just beyond the regulatory perimeter. And that raises the central question for this dissertation. If regulators are relying on banks to please complex technology firms on their behalf, regulating by proxy, does that strategy still work in a world of opaque middleware, fragmented ledgers, and nested agency chains? And my study tackles that question empirically by comparing what regulators actually do in enforcement actions and with what banks and fintechs say is operationally possible in their responses to the 2024 Interagency Request for Information on Bank Fintech Partnerships. Economists, lawyers, and operations people are all looking at the same system, but they're not really talking to each other. To explain why these partnerships keep breaking, I pull those strands into one simple story about principal-agent failure in bank fintech relationships. First, the economic literature focuses on incentives. It shows that many of these partnerships are basically a form of regulatory arbitrage. The profitable parts of banking, such as customer acquisition and rapid product launches and associated products, sit with the fintech. The heavy parts, the capital requirements, the compliance considerations, the deposit insurance, they sit with the bank. And that split hardwires incentive misalignment. The fintech gets paid for growth and speed, and the bank gets judged on safety and soundness. The 2023 third-party guidance, which was interagency guidance, cements this by saying, in effect, bank, your duty is non-delegable. Regulators supervise the bank, and the bank is expected to supervise everyone else. And that's what I call regulation by proxy. Second, the legal literature highlights the blind spot. U.S. law is built to regulate chartered entities, not lines of code. Oversight follows the charter, not the app. And when key decisions and data live on a fintech server outside of the bank's building and sometimes outside of its legal reach, they fall into a gray zone at the edge of the regulatory perimeter. Regulators can't easily touch the fintech directly, so they push harder on the one actor that they can reach, the bank. And that creates a structural monitoring gap. The bank's told, you're fully responsible. But the actual control over products and data is drifting outside of its walls. And third, the operational literature shows where this becomes a real-world break. It calls this technical disaggregation. In a traditional bank, origination, the core systems, and the ledger all sit inside one organization. In banking as a service, those functions are sliced up across APIs, middleware, and platform providers. The fintech owns the user interface and much of the data, middleware controls the plumbing, and the bank owns the license and liability. And that fragmentation snaps the risk management feedback loops that creates extreme information asymmetry. The bank is legally on the hook for customers and transactions it can only see through delayed or filtered feeds, if at all. And that leads directly to the gap my project targets. We already know that incentives are skewed, that laws lag behind the technology, and that operations are deeply fragmented. The literature has mapped all of that. What we don't know is how the enforcement response sits on top of this reality. Are regulators' orders and penalties aimed at the same choke points that banks and fintechs say are binding? Things like contract limits, capacity constraints, and data visibility. Or are they, in principal agent terms, shouting instructions down a chain that physically can't carry them? That brings us to the empirical gap. We have economists who can tell us why the incentives are skewed, and lawyers who can tell us how the rules are written and enforced. But those conversations are happening in parallel, and no one is measuring the point of impact between them. We therefore don't know whether enforcement is bearing down on the same bottlenecks that industry identifies as binding, or whether regulation by proxy is quietly demanding things that are contractually, technically, or capacity-wise out of reach. My dissertation is designed to bridge that gap by building those two corpora side by side and reading them through a common principal agent framework so we can see where the narratives align and where they diverge. To analyze this friction, I anchor the project in principal agent theory, drawing on Jensen and Meckling's classic account of agency costs. At its core, the theory asks a simple question. What happens when one party, the principal, hands over control to another, the agent, to perform a task? Because the agent has its own incentives, information, and constraints, some degree of slippage is inevitable. The principal must spend resources watching, nudging, and sometimes disciplining the agent. And even then, there's always some risk that remains. In other words, delegation is never free. It always comes with agency costs. On this slide, I break those costs into three familiar buckets. Monitoring costs are everything the principal does to keep an eye on the agent. Audits, examinations, on-site reviews, independent consultations, data pulls, continuous oversight. In a bank fintech world, that means exam teams reading through third-party contracts, sampling transactions flowing through an app, or demanding new reports from program managers and middleware providers. Bonding costs are what the agent does to reassure the principal. Compliance officers, certifications, insurance guarantees, contractual promises that signal, you can trust me to run this part of your business. And here, think of fintechs hiring their own compliance teams, buying cyber insurance, or paying independent model validations to convince partner banks and examiners and exam staff that they're safe counterparties. And even after all that, there's residual loss, the unmitigated risk of an inefficiency that still leaks through the system. Compliance breakdowns that no one catches in time, biased algorithms the bank doesn't fully understand, or operational failures at the vendor that still land on the bank's balance sheet. I chose this framework because banking as a service is, at bottom, a chain of delegation and a story about the cost of trust. Regulators delegate to banks. Banks delegate to fintechs. Fintechs may delegate again to cloud providers, data brokers, and servicing platforms. At each step, someone is paying monitoring costs, someone is incurring bonding costs, and someone is absorbing residual loss. Principal agent theory gives us a structured language for describing those trade-offs and for asking where exactly the cost of keeping this ecosystem safe is landing. But the simple traditional model assumes a simple bilateral relationship, a single principal and a single agent. And that picture no longer fits a world of stacked partnerships. Let's talk about that. We must modify principal agent theory because what we have is a stacked chain of delegation. At the top of that stack sits the regulator as the ultimate principal. It delegates safety and soundness expectations to the bank. The bank then turns around and becomes the principal itself, delegating core functions to a fintech who performs various functions, such as onboarding, underwriting, and servicing. And in turn, the fintech delegates down to its vendors. The key insight from this nested agency view is that control and visibility degrade at every step in the vertical chain. For the regulator's expectations to matter at the bottom, they have to be translated into contracts, audit rights, data access, and monitoring all the way down the chain. If the bank's contract with the fintech is weak, or if the technology is effectively a black box at the fintech, the regulator's practical authority stops at the bank's door, even though the bank is still on the hook. The classic agency costs, monitoring, bonding, and residual loss don't appear just once. They compound as we move from regulator to bank to fintech to fourth-party providers. There's also a horizontal problem, which I flag here as common agency. The same bank is being pulled by multiple principals at once, including some combination of the FDIC, the OCC or the Fed, 50 state regulators, and often private rule setters like card networks. These principals are only partially coordinated, so their expectations don't always line up. And that horizontal tug-of-war changes what kinds of contracts and monitoring regimes are even feasible for a given bank. For this talk, I'm going to focus on the vertical chain because that's where the enforcement story is the sharpest. It's this nested structure, from regulator to bank to fintech to vendors, that generates the three mechanisms that I'll discuss in the next slide. For this nested agency framework, I derive three specific levers that I expect to drive alignment or misalignment between regulators and fintech-aligned banks. P1 is contractability. Contractability is the extent to which regulatory expectations can be translated into clear, enforceable obligations and verifiable performance down the chain, from regulator to bank to fintech to fourth parties. Highly specified requirements such as independent annual audits, defined reporting timelines, or explicit data access rights are relatively easy to write into contracts and monitor. Vague mandates such as have a strong risk culture or appropriate customer outcomes are far harder to formalize or prove. I predict the sharpest divergence where expectations have low contractability, such as an expectation for strong risk culture. Banks will acknowledge the objective but struggle to convert it to legally enforceable duties, particularly for powerful partners, producing misalignment even when they're acting in good faith. P2 is capacity. Now, capacity captures the human, technical, and organizational resources banks can devote to monitoring complex partnerships. Large institutions with dedicated vendor management and model risk teams are better positioned to pass through demanding expectations than community or regional banks that have a lean number of compliance staff who are supporting multiple high-volume programs. Here I anticipate a pattern of divergence with engagement. Capacity-constrained agents will largely understand and even endorse regulatory goals, but their request for information letters will emphasize feasibility problems, implementation timelines, staffing, and examination burden, rather than disputing the goals themselves. P3 is observability. Observability refers to how much principals can actually see their agents' behavior and outcomes. In many partnerships, key functions like underwriting, using alternative data, fraud screening, or real-time transaction monitoring are executed by the fintechs or the fintech's vendors. When banks lack meaningful access to code, to logs, to raw data, they cannot fully observe the risks for which they remain legally responsible. And here I predict divergence with silence. Regulators will emphasize these blind spot domains and enforcement orders, while banks' comment letters will either say little, reflecting the fact that some risks are technically invisible, or non-negotiable given vendor power. And taken together, these levers generate testable expectations for the study. High alignment where expectations are contractable, capacity is sufficient, and observability is strong. Divergence with engagement where contractability is moderate but capacity binds. And divergence with silence where observability breaks down, leaving banks accountable for risks they can neither fully see nor fully control. The breakdown we saw with Synapse was not an isolated incident, it was a symptom of a much larger disconnect. This leads directly to the formal problem statement of this dissertation. To understand the root of this failure, we must move beyond the individual anecdotes and look at the systemic data. and my research focuses on this primary question. How and why do enforcement themes from the last 3 years align or fail to align with the specific industry constraints reported in the 2024 Interagency Request for Information? Essentially, I'm asking, is the regulator punishing the exact same risks that the industry claims are operationally unmanageable, or are these two groups speaking entirely different languages? Answering this requires us to analyze the two conflicting narratives currently dominating the market. To answer this question, I'm using a qualitative, comparative, abductive design. Qualitative here means I'm not running regressions on numbers. I'm doing close reading of text to understand meaning and context. Comparative means I'm always looking at two voices side by side, the regulators in their enforcement orders and the industry in its request for information comment letters, rather than treating either one in isolation. The method I use is interpretive context analysis, and that's different from just counting keywords. I'll read the documents in my corpus in context, paying attention to how each side frames responsibility, risk, and feasibility. I describe the overall logic as abductive. In practice, that means I move back and forth between theory and data. I start with deductive seed codes that come straight from the principal agent framework and the three mechanisms I laid out earlier: contractibility, capacity, and observability. And those give me an initial set of lenses for reading both corpora, but I also keep the design open to inductive discovery. If the comment letters keep talking about something my theory didn't predict, that becomes a new code and potentially a new mechanism. And finally, in this pragmatist design, the point is not to build an elegant model for its own sake. It's to surface patterns that matter for real people making policy and compliance decisions. Using an abductive, interpretive approach lets me keep theory in the loop, but always test it against what regulators and industry actors are actually saying on page. On this slide, I just want to flag the methodological innovation in the project, which is AI-assisted coding with strong guardrails. From my stance, the AI is only a tool. I retain full interpretive authority. That means I decide what codes are, how they're defined, and how evidence is interpreted. Every AI suggestion is checked against actual documents and the theory before it goes into the codebook. In phase one, I use a hybrid approach to build the codebook. I start with deductive seed codes from principal agent theory and the P1, P2, P3 mechanisms. Then I let the AI model scan mixed batches of enforcement actions and RFI letters to propose additional patterns. Once that iterative stage stabilizes, I follow a specific codebook freeze protocol in which no new codes are added, either by myself or AI. And this is how I'll try to get to the efficiency of AI without giving up qualitative rigor. Following the freeze, I'll proceed to phase 2, where I'll manually code 100% of the documents using in vivo. This is essential. I'm not using AI to avoid work. I'm doing the work myself to ensure deep familiarity with the text. In phase 3, I'll introduce a validity check. I'll use ChatGPT to perform independent coding paths using the frozen codebook and the enforcement actions and RFI comments. If there's a dispute between the codes previously selected or new codes based on ChatGPT's input, I'll log those decisions for purposes of transparency. The data will be divided into 2 buckets. Category A is operational themes, the cause. These are the ways regulators and industry describe what's going wrong in bank fintech partnerships. Gaps in monitoring, data visibility issues, capacity constraints, all of that. Because both enforcement actions and RFI letters talk about operations, I code these themes in both corpora. They're my picture of the underlying mechanics of failure. Category B is remedial themes, the effect. These only appear in enforcement actions because only regulators can order a bank to do something. Here I'm coding what the agencies actually prescribe as cures: independent consultants, new reporting lines, contract rewrites, etc. The analytical move is to pair the two. For each operational theme in Category A, I ask what kind of remedies show up in Category B, if any. When these causes described by the bank and fintechs in the RFI line up with the effects, imposed in enforcement, same problem, similar fix, that's high alignment. When the cause is acknowledged but the prescribed fix seems infeasible or mismatched, that's divergence with engagement. And when I see big remedies around issues that the industry barely mentions or big operational pain points with no corresponding remedies, that's divergence with silence. This cause and effect structure is what lets me turn a big pile of coded text into concrete statements about where regulation by proxy is and isn't calibrated to how these partnerships actually work. Well, thank you for your time and your guidance. I welcome your questions and feedback.